So this presentation is on the major religions of the world, and I'm going to warn you right now, it is a pretty long presentation, so you might want to, do a few of the faiths and then take a break and then do a few more, but approach it as you see fit. So looking at the number of adherents, people who belong to each faith, we see that Christianity is the largest religion on earth with nearly 2.5 billion adherents, believers. Islam is second with nearly 2 billion. Third would be Hinduism, which is largely confined to the Indian subcontinent, but that's still a very large population, just over a billion. Followed by Buddhism, largely confined to Eastern Asia, at 500 million people. Chinese traditional religion, which we'll see is kind of a blended faith, and again largely confined to China, is at 390 million. And then Judaism, I'm including, even though obviously it's a very, very small number of adherents compared to all of the other religions, but I'm including it because of its relationship to the two largest faiths, Christianity and Islam. And we'll see that a little bit later. So, looking at percentages of the Earth's population, you can kind of see the breakout there. I will point out that this data is 10 years old, and so there definitely have been some slight changes. Um, Non-religious has definitely grown in that period of time, largely in the West, as the West becomes less and less religious. So we'll start with Hinduism. We're starting with Hinduism because it is the oldest faith that is continued to be practiced. Judaism is also quite old, but the modern practice of Judaism is more recent. So here are the terms that you're going to need for Hinduism. Why don't you go ahead and just pause the video here for a moment and get these words into your notebook, and then as we go along, you'll be able to add the definitions. So, Hinduism. Hinduism isn't one thing in the way that Christianity has some very basic elements that everyone subscribes to. In Christianity, you have to believe in Jesus Christ as the Lord and Savior and Son of God and all that stuff. Um, but Hinduism is much, much broader. Hinduism does not have a founder in the way that Christianity and Islam have founders. It doesn't have a particular holy book that everyone subscribes to, like the Bible or the Quran. And there is no hierarchical, like a leadership structure. So Hinduism doesn't have a pope, for example. As we saw before, there's 1.2 billion Hindus in the world, but the vast majority of them are in India. And the very roots of Hinduism are 3,500 years old. But modern Hinduism developed starting around 500 BCE in the form that it is practiced today. So let's look at some of the core beliefs of Hinduism. Uh, we start with Dharma, that is one of your terms. Dharma is sort of natural law, and it kind of ties all Hindu beliefs together. And Hindu's ultimate aim is to escape from the cycle of reincarnation, which is an underpinning of Hinduism, as well as a couple of other faiths. And if you follow that natural law, then you're much more likely to be able to achieve moksha and break out of that cycle of reincarnation. Hindus believe that the universe has no beginning or end. So just as Christianity and Islam and Judaism all believe that there was a beginning, right? The book of Genesis. But Hindus don't have that. They're more like the Mayans in the sense that, yes, the universe is constantly recycling itself, so to speak. And the way you attain moksha is to overcome ignorance and lose desire for anything at all. And once you've achieved that, then you have broken that cycle of reincarnation and you can achieve moksha. So, Purusharthas, the four basic objectives in the lives of practicing Hindus, obviously following natural law or ethics, right? So you want to live an ethical life. Artha, which is livelihood or wealth. So the concept of acquisition of wealth is built right into Hinduism in a way that is not the case in other faiths. Kama is pleasure, right? So one of the objectives of life is pleasure, and I think that's something that we can kind of all understand. And then moksha, which is getting out of that cycle of reincarnation, which is called samsara. So let's look at that a little bit. Samsara. So the idea within Hinduism is that your soul is in a cycle of being born and then dying and then being reborn, and that the goal of one's ultimate eternal existence is to get out of that cycle, to achieve moksha. Hindus want to live in a way that causes their life to be better than the life that they had previous to the one that they're in. So you want to do better, right? Because by doing better, you're more likely, following Dharma, you're much more likely to break out of that cycle and achieve moksha. So this is all based around the idea of karma. My guess is that karma is a term and a concept that you're already familiar with, but if you're not, the idea is that if you do good things, then good things will happen to you. If you do bad things, then bad things will happen to you. So you want good karma, right? That's probably a term you've heard before. You want good karma because that is going to speed up the journey towards getting out of samsara and achieving moksha. A little bit at some Hindu gods, because there's one ultimate god named Brahman, but Brahman shows itself in a lot of different ways. So Hinduism is kind of at the same time both a monotheistic religion and a polytheistic religion. Remember that monotheistic is the belief in one God. So Christianity, Islam, Judaism, those are monotheistic faiths. Whereas Hinduism is usually referred to as a polytheistic because you have many, many gods, but ultimately all of those gods are just manifestations of Brahman. So the three kind of the biggest ones are Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva, and they reflect different aspects of Brahman. I know it's confusing that you have Brahman and Brahma, but just do your best. So Brahma is a reflection of Brahman creating the universe. Vishnu is a reflection of Brahman's work in maintaining the existence of the universe, and in opposition to Vishnu is Shiva, and Shiva reflects Brahman's work in destroying the universe, right? So just as humans have a cycle of birth and death and rebirth, the universe, as we said, has a cycle of birth and death and rebirth. And in order for there to be death, there has to be destruction, right? So Shiva is the destroyer god. But then there are lots of other gods that reflect different aspects of Brahman, and there are hundreds, if not thousands. I'll just use Ganesha, because Ganesha might be one that you've seen before, and Ganesha is the god of luck. So we're going to look at a couple of images. So this is a representation of Brahman. You'll notice that Hindu art tends to have really, really vivid colors, and you'll see that the gods don't look entirely human. So Brahman has 3 heads and 4 arms. Again, it's a manifestation, right? Um, but I want you to pay attention to the hand gestures, right? So He's got one holding a flower, one holding a little, looks like a scroll. His lower or lower right hand is making a particular gesture with the index finger pointed up. I want you to pay attention to that. Move on to Vishnu. So this is Vishnu. So again, with the four arms. Vishnu only has one head though, but you see that lower right hand. Now it's straight up and it has an eye in the center of the palm. So an actual piece of sculpture now. And this is a sculpture or it's a metal of Shiva, the destroyer. And Shiva is dancing, as is often the case. Um, and Shiva's left arm is crossed in front of his body, and I shouldn't necessarily say his because there are representations of Shiva as both male and female. Um, but you see the right lower hand is making that gesture where the index finger is pointed. I don't know if you can actually see the eye on Shiva's hand, but it is a very similar gesture to that of Vishnu. And then the last Hindu I'll have you look at is Ganesha. And so Ganesha, there's a whole story about Ganesha got in trouble with Brahman, and he had his head cut off and replaced with the head of an elephant. So that's why he's got a head of an elephant. But we still have four arms, and yet there again, in the right hand, you see it's held straight up, and he has that eye in the center of his palm. So that's all for Hinduism. And so now we're going to look at Buddhism. But the first thing I want you to look at with Buddhism is the fact that while this representation of the Buddha only has two arms and one head, you still see that hand positioned in very much the same way as you saw in the other representations of Hindu gods. And there's a really, really good reason for that, which we'll get to in a moment. So here are the terms that you're going to need for Buddhism. Again, just as before, why don't you go ahead and pause this slide and get those terms into your notebook, and then you'll be able to fill in the definitions as we move on. So Buddhism was founded in about 450 BCE by a man named Siddhartha Gautama. Eventually, Siddhartha became the Buddha, which means enlightened one, when he was just 29 years old. He was a wealthy guy. He was a prince, but he was trying to find the meaning of life, and by spending a great deal of time meditating, he eventually became enlightened. And the main teaching of Buddhism is you have to eliminate desire, right? Wanting, craving. Those are the things that cause suffering in the world. Um, like Hinduism, Buddhism doesn't have a leader. Tibetan Buddhism does, but the other types of Buddhism, there's no single authority, there's no sacred book like there is in Christianity. And then again, very similarly to Hinduism, the goal of existence is to attain that enlightenment. So the Buddhists refer to it as nirvana, but it's a very similar concept to moksha in Hinduism. And there's a big reason for that, and that's that Buddhism was an outgrowth of Hinduism. The area in which Siddhartha lived was in India, and that was Hinduism was the religion, and so you see you see shades of Hinduism and Buddhism in the same way that you see shades of Christianity and Judaism in Islam, and we'll see that in a little while. So the Four Noble Truths are the essential underpinning of Buddhism, the essential philosophy of Buddhism, and that starts with the idea that life is suffering. Our very existence is suffering. And the main cause of that suffering is wanting or craving or attachment to things. And the way that you end that suffering that drives your life is to end craving and end attachment to things, to people, everything. And in order to end that craving, there's a specific pathway that you need to be able to follow. It's not like a step by step, it's just a list of things that you need to be able to do. And so that Noble Eightfold Path, it's like I said, it's a progression. It's not a progression, it's a wheel. And so what what Buddhists are supposed to do is have, and I'll go over this very briefly: right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right concentration, and right mindfulness. Now, this is aspirational. In a sense, it's kind of like the Ten Commandments, but the Ten Commandments is God saying to Jews and Christians and Muslims, "You must do it my way." Whereas since there is no God in Buddhism, really, the Buddha himself is more a figure of veneration, like the Prophet Muhammad, than like Jesus Christ, who is believed to be actually the Son of God or whatever. So we want to do the right thing. We want to see truth. We want to not be a jerk with our language. We want to not kill people. We want to we don't want to do bad things to make money, right? We don't want to be engaging in the slave trade and selling drugs and stuff like that. Because Buddhists are vegetarian, they also add killing animals to that list as well. Always do your best on everything, meditate, and maintain control over your thoughts. That's a hard list to accomplish, right? But it's aspirational, meaning that it's something that Buddhists hope to be able to achieve. So we're going to take a look right now at the traditional Chinese religions, and it's important to understand the way in which these religions are all simultaneously and interchangeably observed. So again, here are your terms. Go ahead and pause the video and get these terms written down in your notebook. And as we go along with the presentation, you'll be able to fill in the definitions. So there are really four aspects of the Chinese traditional religious model. One of them is Buddhism, which we've just discussed, and then the other three we'll get to in a moment. But the important thing to understand is that it's not like Christianity, where there's one set of rules and one book and one God. Uh, Chinese people who are religious in some way tend to have a blend of these four concepts. So we've already talked about Buddhism, so we'll go on at we're going to look at Confucianism. So the fundamental question with Confucianism is: this is an ethical, like a belief system, or is it a religion, or is it some combination thereof? The ideas were first put together by a man named Kung Fu Tzu, and then that has been uh, transliterated into English as Confucius. So he was alive somewhere around 500 BCE. Another important aspect of Confucianism is there is no God. Not that God doesn't exist per se, but Confucianism is not built around the teachings of some sort of higher power. It's based on the structure of a traditional Chinese family. And so there's this notion of what's called reciprocity. It's reciprocal, which is the idea that in a relationship, there is a give and a take. So, parent and child, parents give and children take, but then children theoretically give and parents take. I'm not sure what it is that the children are giving, but that's a story for another time. Husband and wife, older sibling, younger sibling, employer, employee would be another example of that as well. And so there's some key underlying principles that are essential to understand. One of them is Shao, which is filial piety. Filial piety means you treat elders with respect. Ren, which is benevolence, kindness, right? Being a good person. And then Li, which is respecting that idea of reciprocity. If you are a child, you respect your parent and you do those things that your parents expect of you, and vice versa. Parents need to do those things that parents are required and expected to do for their children. So the second element is Taoism, and Taoism is usually pronounced as if the first letter was a D, but the first letter when we write it is a T. So I just want you to understand that difference. So it comes into it's very old faith, but it comes into its modern form about 2,500 years ago. And the idea is that your goal is to live in harmony with the rhythm of the universe. And that rhythm of the universe is what's called the Tao. The Tao is sometimes translated as a force in the universe. Um, and, somebody once referred to the Force, like in Star Wars, as religion's greatest hits. So this would just be an example of that, about how this mystical power or rhythm in the universe gets added into popular culture. Um, so if Tao is that rhythm that we're supposed to kind of be in harmony with, then Te is the expression, is walking the path, right? So if the Tao is the path, Te is the walking of the path. Similarly to Buddhism, there is an idea of trying to be kind of disengaged from the world, to not have attachments. And then there is this yin and yang, and you have actually, I'm sure, seen that symbol before in the lower right corner of the slide. The idea of dualism, that there is light and dark in the universe. There is masculine and feminine, positive and negative, sometimes manifested also as like fire and water, or so this dualism is built right into the Tao, the rhythm of the universe. And again, if you're a Star Wars nerd, then you also know that the Force has a light side and a dark side. So again, there's a lot built in there that then it becomes represented in popular culture. And then Ziran is the act of getting away from selfishness and desire. So this is another example where we see some overlap between Taoism and Buddhism. And so that also plays into how in traditional Chinese religions, there is a blending of these different faiths. And that's just an example where there's some overlap. So the last component of traditional Chinese religion is folk religion. And folk religion, again, goes back to it was 2,300 years ago. And it has sort of been a growing thing. It was the ethnic faith of the Han Chinese people. And when we get to studying China, you'll understand. But the Han Chinese are an ethnic group, and that is the dominant ethnic group in China. Sometimes in the West, we have a tendency to think that China is just monolithic and all Chinese people are ethnically Chinese, and that's just not true at all. There are tens of millions of people who live in China but are not of the ethnic Han Chinese group. Right. One example would be a group of Muslims called the Uyghurs in Western China. They're currently being horrifically oppressed. Um, so, as the Han Chinese and the Han dynasty grow and spread across China, starting about 2,200 years ago, then that Chinese folk religion travels with it. So some of the concepts, well, you can see the whole list there, but some of them are definitely taken from other faiths, like the yin and the yang, or the idea of morality, which morality is built into every single religion. But then there's also this idea of qi, which is spelled QI, and that is the energy of the universe, right? So what is it that brings life to everything? And that's qi. And sometimes in traditional Chinese medicine, if you're familiar with that at all, like acupuncture, that is the attempt to manipulate the qi which exists in your body. Again, if you're really married to Western medicine, then you maybe think that this is kind of all not real. But there are obviously a lot of different views of existence, and there is a little bit of evidence to suggest that maybe chi is something that can be manipulated within the body, but that's a much bigger conversation. So now we're going to shift out of Asia. The first three topics that we looked at were all more or less based in Asia: Hinduism, Buddhism, and Chinese folk religion. But we're going to move on. So we're going to look at Judaism now. Judaism is the oldest of the Western Asian faiths, and it is sort of the father and the grandfather of Christianity and Islam. So we have a few terms here. Some of these terms you might already be familiar with, but as we've done on the previous religions, go ahead and pause this slide and get those terms down. And then as we move into the slides, you'll be able to fill in the definitions. So, Judaism is the oldest existing monotheistic faith, at least in the West. You could make an argument that Hinduism is also monotheistic, but in Western society, Judaism is the oldest monotheistic faith. And the idea is that there is one all powerful God named Yahweh who created everything. And Yahweh has a special relationship with the Jews due to this kind of agreement that God made with Moses about 3,500 years ago. Now, according to that Hebrew Bible, Judaism was founded by a man named Abraham in Mesopotamia. And Abraham decided to take his people, who were called the Hebrews, out of Mesopotamia because they weren't being cool to his people. And they migrate to the area which is the modern day Israel. Eventually, the Hebrews were captured and enslaved in Egypt, but Moses led them out of Egypt and back to the land that is the modern nation of Israel. Now, the capital of both that ancient kingdom and a major city in the modern Israel is Jerusalem. And that Jerusalem had actually existed for centuries prior to the Jews' arrival. It is an incredibly ancient city, but the Jews then adopted it as their capital. Uh, Unfortunately for the Jews, starting in about the second century CE, so about 1800 years ago, the Romans decided to punish them because they rose up against the empire, and the Jews were forced into what is called a diaspora. And the diaspora for the Jews was this uh, event where Jews were forced out of their original homeland and scattered across the Roman Empire and the Persian Empire. And so Jews predominantly congregated in cities across Europe and into the Persian Empire. And there were a lot of reasons why they congregated in cities. One reason is that later on Christians didn't allow Jews to own property, so you couldn't own land. Um, and but Jews were locked out of their ancestral homeland for 17 centuries. It's not until the late 19th century, early 20th century that Jews begin to migrate back to the Holy Land. And eventually in the 20th century, that Holy Land is refounded as the nation state of Israel. So Jewish traditions, they practice their faith in something called a synagogue. And in the person who leads them in their synagogue is called a rabbi. Now, a rabbi isn't like a priest. A priest is sort of somebody who stands between you and God, and interprets the will of God for you. That's not the purpose of the rabbi. The rabbi leads the prayer, and we'll see Islam has a very similar structure to that. Um, all three of the salvationist faiths, so Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, have a Sabbath, a holy day of rest. And that's also straight up in the Bible. It says on the seventh day they rested. Now, each of those faiths has a different day as their seventh day of rest to differentiate from one another. The Jewish Sabbath doesn't start at dawn; it starts at sunset. So sunset on Fridays until sundown on Saturdays. Observant Jews do not work or drive or cook or use any kind of technology. But not all sects of Judaism practice their faith that strongly. There are a lot of secular Jews who might occasionally go to synagogue, but do not observe the Sabbath in that traditional way. There are also dietary restrictions in Judaism and in Islam, as we'll see in a little bit. And so, one of the things that observant Jews, are prohibited from eating are pork products. And there's all kinds of reasons why. Um, Nowadays, whatever diseases you might get from pork, it's much less likely. But once that tradition is enshrined in faith, that's how it is. Um, and if you observe those dietary customs, it's called keeping kosher, right? So kosher means it has been approved by a rabbi, and a lot of packaged foods that you buy in the supermarket actually have a little symbol on them that says that this food is kosher, and that means that observant Jews can go ahead and eat that food. Uh, Jews, as Christians, are governed by the Ten Commandments, which were delivered to Moses on Mount Sinai 3,500 years ago, if you were a believer in such things. And again, those are the exact same Ten Commandments that Christians and Muslims observe as well. Um, Unlike Christianity, Judaism uses a lunar calendar. A lunar calendar is based upon the moon revolving around the earth every 28 days. And as a result of that, Jewish holidays are not on the same day every single year. In the same way that Easter is also not on the same day every single year, but that's because Easter is actually connected to a Jewish holiday, which we'll get to in a little bit. Um, so here are your Ten Commandments. I am the Lord your God, and there can be no other gods, right? And so this is where the Jews got into a problem with the Romans, because the Romans said, you have to worship our gods too. And the Jews said, sorry, we can't, because commandment number 2 is we can't do that. So that was a little bit of a problem for them once the Romans decided to really make an issue out of it. You can't take the Lord's name in vain. You have to follow the Sabbath. You have to honor your mother and father. So again, there's a little bit of that from the Chinese phase of from Confucianism, of filial piety, of being respectful to your elders. Then we get into some really basic ones that kind of appear in most religions as like an organizing structure for society. Don't kill people. Don't commit adultery, which is basically like having sex with people you're not married to. Don't steal, don't lie, and don't covet your neighbor's stuff. Like, don't be greedy and envious of people. So again, those are some basic organizational structures, and we have those same exact 10 commandments in the next two faiths as well. Christianity. My guess is that Christianity is the religion with which most people are most familiar because it is the dominant religion here in the United States. Here are your terms for Christianity. Again, there's quite a lot. Some of them you probably already know. Uh, Even the ones that you think you might actually know, though, I want you to definitely still add them to your notes, because I'm probably going to be giving you a little bit more information than you have right now. So, here are the basics. Christianity was founded by a man named Joshua ben Joseph, or more commonly known, Jesus of Nazareth. And it was about little early in the first century, in the Roman province of Judea, which is modern day Israel. So Israel was conquered by the Romans. They renamed the province Judea, which obviously has a connection to the word Jew. Jesus was a Jew. Jesus was not a Christian. He didn't stand up and say, hey, we're going to have a new religion called Christianity. Nope. He was Jew. He believed himself to be the Messiah. And the Messiah is a figure in the Jewish faith that says that God will manifest himself on earth, and that will be the beginning of the end of the world. So Jesus shows up and he's like, "Hey, I'm the Messiah." And a lot of Jews were not buying it. His teachings were a threat to the ruling structure in the province of Judea. In the province of Judea, yes, it was a Roman province, but it wasn't Romans that lived there; it was Jews. And so Jesus coming in and trying to like disturb the natural order of things was a threat. It was a threat to the power structure. And so as a result of that, the Jews uh, the Jewish authorities figured out a way to convince the Romans to execute Jesus, which they then did. Um, Christianity, over a matter of decades, started to slowly spread through the Roman world, primarily due to the actions of a man named Saul of Tarsus, who eventually changed his name to Paul and is now referred to within Christianity as St. Paul. So it was St. Paul that really was the one that spread the idea of Christianity through the Roman world, at least until the Romans executed him, because they executed him too. Um, the main reason it worked was that people in the Roman world were unhappy with the religions that were available to them, and they were unhappy with society overall. And now here you have Jesus and Paul of Tarsus rolling in and saying, "Hey, we got a new faith for you, and it's really cool, and you should join it." And a lot of people did. Slowly, but over the centuries, it grew into the dominant faith in Western Asia and Europe. So Christianity is spread throughout the Roman Empire, starting with Paul of Tarsus, who went all around Asia Minor, convincing Romans to abandon their traditional faiths that were not as fulfilling to them anymore and join this new faith. The Christians were persecuted for a couple of centuries, and if you've ever heard stories about Christians being fed to the lions in the gladiatorial arenas, that is true. It didn't happen like tons and tons and tons, but it is in fact it is a fact that that was done periodically during these periods of repression. Ultimately, the repression ends because the Emperor Constantine makes Christianity first legal and second the official religion of the Roman Empire. And so going forward after that point, the traditional Roman gods, who are of course based upon the traditional Greek gods like Zeus and Athena and everybody, though that faith dies off over the next century between 300 and 400 CE. And the whole point of Christianity ultimately is to spread itself. Christianity is a salvationist faith, whereas other faiths, Judaism, Jews aren't going around the world trying to convince other people to be Jews. Christians are going around the world convincing other people to be Christians. So that was true 1500 years ago, and it is true today. So here you can see the spread of Christianity. So by about 300 CE, you can see that you have a lot of cities. So just like after the diaspora, Jews went and lived in all of the major cities of the Roman Empire and then eventually Europe and Western Asia once the empire falls. Christians also take advantage of large concentrations of people in cities to spread the faith, starting in Western Asia and Asia Minor, and then eventually spreading into Europe and North Africa. So, one of the underpinnings of Christianity is accepting who and what Christ is. So, early Christians argued about this a lot. Was Christ just a man, like a prophet, like Moses? Was he God? Like literally God manifested on earth, or was he something else, something maybe in between? Um, there is a concept in Christianity, in most branches of Christianity, called the Trinity. And if you are Roman Catholic, you definitely know about this: the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. What you need to understand about the Trinity, though, is that it was a political deal. There were a lot of different types of Christians. when Constantine was trying to make Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. And all of these different little sects of Christians said different things. Christ is God. Christ was just a man. There's something. And so what Constantine did is he took all of those bishops and he literally like locked them in a palace. And he said, you guys don't get to come out until you agree. And so then they had to sit there and figure out something that they could all agree on. And the thing that they agreed on, that they came up with, that they all accepted, was the Trinity. So that the nature of Christ is a mix of God the Father, Jesus the Son, and this Holy Spirit, which is that which unites or joins God the Father to Jesus the Son. So the Trinity was a political deal. So we've already talked a little bit about the relationship between Christianity and the Roman Empire. Um, the Roman Empire did ultimately collapse, but it was the Western half which collapsed first, and then it took 1,000 years for the Eastern Roman Empire or the Byzantine Empire to collapse. So at first it was a unifying force, but there was too much political instability and invasions of other groups of people from Eurasia that ultimately destroyed the Western Empire. But then for centuries, the only thing which united the lands that used to be the Western Empire is Christianity. And this is how you get the rise of the Pope as a political figure. Um, so the church becomes the most stable institution in society for nearly 1,000 years in Western Europe. Now, Christianity is divided. As you know, there are many, many, many different Christian faiths. And when we get into the 14 and 1500s in Europe, we'll learn about how the Protestant movement grew. But during this period, we really have a basic division between two groups. You have Eastern Orthodox Christianity, which is the Christianity that was practiced in the Byzantine Empire, and it is also the form of Christianity practiced across most of Eastern Europe and Russia, as well as Greece. The other division in Christianity was Roman Catholicism, and that was the version of Christianity that was dominant in Western Europe. And while Roman Catholicism has evolved over the centuries, we are talking about essentially the same organization which exists today. You have a pope who is the leader of the church. You have bishops and archbishops and cardinals who have political roles within the church, and at a certain period of time, literal political roles. So Roman Catholicism, in a way, is structured identically to the political structure of the Roman Empire, where you have an emperor at the top, and then you have all these governors that are in control of different areas. So Roman Catholicism was built very much on that model, and that model very much exists to this day. Uh, the Orthodox faith had a similar structure, but once the Byzantine Empire collapsed, there is now no longer a single leader of Orthodox Christianity. You have somebody in charge of Greek Orthodox, you have somebody in charge of Russian Orthodox, and so forth. So, nominally, Eastern Orthodox Christianity and Roman Catholicism were a part of the same faith. They pretended, at least, that they were a part of the same religion, at least until the year 1054, at which point, and it's the reasons why they broke up, so to speak, are by our standards unbelievably stupid. It has to do with one line of text in the creed that all Christians are supposed to believe in. So there was that aspect, but then there was also the political aspect, because again, the Pope was, and to a certain extent still is, a political figure. The Pope wanted to assert his dominance over all of Eastern Christianity, and the Eastern Orthodox faith were like, no, we don't want you. And so ultimately, that kind of bickering back and forth led to this ultimate breakup. And even though there have been attempts over the last 1,000 years to try to get Catholicism and Orthodoxy to kind of be together again, it never happens. So the last thing we'll look at, which is again predates where the course actually begins in 1200 CE, we have the Crusades. And again, this ultimately, there was a political dynamic to this, but the Crusades start when the Pope in 1095 says that Christians have to go to the Holy Land and capture Jerusalem, because at that point, all of Western Asia was under control of the various Muslim empires, which we will look at when we get to that period. There were four crusades, different levels of success. The first crusade was the most successful. They captured a number of cities in the Holy Land, including Jerusalem. Um, but the Christians didn't, unfortunately, behave in such a Christian way because they massacred everybody when they took those cities. So just as today, Jerusalem has a mixed population. The modern city of Jerusalem has elements of Jews and Muslims and Christians. And that was true 1,000 years ago. And when the Crusaders, when the European Christians showed up, they killed everybody in Jerusalem and Acre and the other cities of the Middle East. Didn't matter. Muslim, Jew, Christian, doesn't matter. They killed them all. Um, but ultimately the Crusades were not successful because the Christians were not able to hold on to the Holy Land overall for more than about 200 years. I mean, I guess if you're living within those 200 years, you would think it's successful, but they never conquered the entire Holy Land. They were too disorganized. They fought amongst themselves, and finally, the last Crusader city falls in 1291. Um, but unlike the Christians, when the Christians rolled into those cities and murdered everybody, when the Muslims came back, they didn't. And they said, okay, if you want to live here, you can live here. If you don't want to live here anymore, then you can leave, and we're not going to even kill you. You can just bail and you can go back to Europe if you want. But you can stay, and all you have to do is pay the special tax that Muslims require non-Muslims to pay. And we'll learn about that in a little bit. So we're now going to look at Islam. Here are the terms that you will need to know for Islam. So you should pause this slide and get these terms written down. Again, there may be a few here that you're already familiar with. So some basic facts about Islam. It was founded in 622 CE by the man we now refer to as the Prophet Muhammad. It was founded in the modern nation state of Saudi Arabia in a city called Mecca. And it's a salvationist faith in the same way that Christianity is. So Islam does try to spread itself, but not as aggressively as Christianity does. They worship the same God that Jews and Christians worship. They just have a different name for that God. So the Jews refer to that God as Yahweh. The Christians refer to that God as Jehovah when they're not calling God God. And the Muslims refer to that God as Allah. Just like Christianity, there is a split in Islam between Sunni Islam and Shia Islam, and the reasons for that split are as arcane as the reasons that there was a split within Christianity. Islam, the actual word means surrender, right? You are surrendering yourself to God. Um, Islam also provides a governmental structure, right? So it's not just a religious system, it's also a legal system. And that legal system is referred to as Sharia or Islamic law. Now, Sharia has a negative connotation sometimes in America, but that's because of the amount of Islamophobia that there is in America. There are just as many laws within Christianity that are, to one degree or another, forced upon people who are not Christian. So here you can see the spread of Islam. It was the most rapid spread of any faith. It took hundreds and hundreds of years for Christianity to spread itself across all of the Roman Empire, but you can see in a matter of 130 years, Islam spreads from Afghanistan to France. So that's an incredibly rapid. It was just as Christianity rolled onto the scene, and people were like, "Hey, I like that Christianity. I'm gonna become a Christian." Islam shows up with a similar belief set to Christians, but differing in some key ways that were much more appealing to uh, prospective Muslims. So there are five key pillars of Islam that is the core of the belief structure and what Muslims are expected to do. So there's the recitation of the faith, or the Shahada, and that is there is no God but God, and Muhammad is his prophet. The second pillar is that you need to pray 5 times a day and you need to face Mecca. So, in mosques, which are the places where Muslims worship, there is some sort of fixture that is on the wall that more or less is pointed in the direction of Mecca in Saudi Arabia. You are also expected to give charity to the needy. So, whatever, Christianity has a similar idea of a tithe where you're supposed to give a certain percentage of the amount of money that you make to the church. So, the idea there is that it is the expectation that religion will help people who cannot help themselves. Another pillar is during the month of Ramadan that observant Muslims fast during the daylight hours. So from sunup to sundown, you don't eat. Now, there's a it's a very reasonable structure in that it's right there in the holy texts that if you are sick or very old or very young, you are not expected to fast, right? They don't want people to sicken themselves for the sake of the fourth pillar. But if you are a healthy person, then that is the expectation if you are an observant Muslim. Now, just like the Jewish calendar, which is a lunar calendar, the Muslim calendar is a lunar calendar as well. So Ramadan happens at different times in the solar year, and it's driven by that lunar calendar. And then the fifth pillar is the Hajj, and the Hajj is the pilgrimage to Mecca once in your life, if you it is possible for you to do so, if you are wealthy enough to make the trip, that you go once in your life to Mecca, to the holiest site in Islam. Now, again, that one is only something that you do if you have the means to be able to do it. So, some basic ideas within Islam. They also have a Sabbath. As we know, the Christian Sabbath is Sunday. You now know that the Jewish Sabbath is Saturday. Well, the Muslim Sabbath is Friday, and it is a sundown to sundown Sabbath in the same way that the Jewish Sabbath is a sundown to sundown, as opposed to sunrise to sunrise, as it is in Christianity. Uh, the house of worship, as we said, is called a mosque, and that is an example of an incredibly glorious mosque in the image to the right. Uh, and they are led by an imam. An imam is similar to a rabbi and different from a priest in the sense that they just lead the call to prayer. That's all. You don't have to access God through the imam. You access God directly. You have a direct relationship with God. There's a term that is misunderstood in the West because of the number of wars that we have fought in the Middle East, and that is the idea of jihad. So, oftentimes, if you've ever heard the word jihad before, you've heard the word jihad in the context of Islamic terrorism in all likelihood. But jihad simply means struggle. It means the internal struggle to follow the word of God and to be a good Muslim. That is the idea of jihad. And it's unfortunate that that term is warped into this idea that it's about violence. Now, it is warped within radical Islam for sure, but unfortunately in the West, we only understand that definition of jihad and not that greater idea. So, the holy books. The Holy Testament is called the Quran, And the idea of the Quran is that Allah spoke to the people through the voice of Muhammad. So Muhammad would have these experiences where he would like go into a trance and his like voice would change and people would sit around and they would write everything he said. And it was usually like these little stories. They were like just kind of morality tales rather than um, almost like a historical thing that certain parts of the Bible are that are actually describing event in the lives of Moses or Jesus or whomever. Now, in addition to the Quran, you also have Hadith. And Hadith is a much larger set of texts, and it's about the interpretation of of the prophet's words and actions, and it's used to uh, grapple with an understanding of what it is that Allah looks for in observant Muslims. And so you take the Quran and the Hadith and you put them together, and that makes up Sharia. And so the idea of Sharia law is law that is based upon what is written in the Quran and Hadith. So mentioned before that there are two branches of Islam. There are the Sunni and the Shia. Now, almost 90% of Muslims are Sunni Muslims, so the vast majority of Muslims on earth, all around the world, are Sunni Muslims. Shia Islam and the people who follow it are sometimes called Shia or sometimes called Shiites. And that's the pronunciation of that word, so don't be silly with it. They are, for the most part, in Iran and Iraq. There are small communities of Shia Muslims in other places around the world, including the United States, but the vast majority of Shia Muslims are in Iran and Iraq. Um, the split was based upon who was going to be the leader. So it was another thing where like this group of people said, no, the Prophet Muhammad's cousin or something, nephew maybe, should be the leader of the faith. And then the other guy, the rest of them said, no, it should be this other guy. In fact, it also is based on tribal divisions that had existed before Islam. There were groups of Arabs that tended to ally themselves militarily with the Roman Empire, and there were other tribes of Arabs that aligned themselves with the Persian Empire. And it just so happens that that division between Sunni and Shia also very closely mirrors that division between the Arabs that went with the Romans and the Arabs that went with the Persians. And unfortunately, there are places where that division does lead to violence. Now, the caliphate. Islam used to have a pope-like figure who was both a political leader and a spiritual leader. Um, there is no one caliph anymore, although if you remember ISIS or the Islamic State, their goal was to try to create a new caliphate. So the caliph is that spiritual leader, or I should say was that spiritual leader because there isn't one anymore. So the first caliphate was called the Umayyads, and they conquered most of the Eastern Mediterranean region. So those were areas that had been ruled by the Byzantine uh, Empire or the Persian Empire. And part of the reason why it became popular was a very basic reason, which is that the Muslim leaders didn't ask as much in taxes from the people. Now, that to us maybe seemed like a silly reason to switch a religion, but during these periods of endless war between the Romans and the Persians, taxes were outrageously high. And so you have this new political leader who's also a religious leader who says, hey, join our religion and your taxes are going to be lower. Well, that was enough for some people. So then eventually the Umayyad Caliphate is replaced by the Abbasid Caliphate, and that one actually lasts for a very long time. And the capital is moved out of Mecca to Baghdad, which is the same Baghdad that is the capital of Iraq today. And they grew their empire even further. They added parts of the Indian subcontinent and the rest of North Africa and Spain to their caliphate. And then there is no caliphate for a couple hundred years until the Ottomans arrive. And the Ottoman Empire, which we'll talk a lot about when we get deeper into the course, they took the title of caliphate in a ceremonial way. The Sultan of the Ottoman Empire did not rule over all of the lands that Muslims lived in, like Persia and India and Spain. They controlled most of Western Asia and North Africa, though, and actually a big chunk of Europe for a few hundred years. But the term caliph was still associated with the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire until there was no longer a sultan. So we Muslims had a caliph until 1924, right? So less than 100 years ago. And as I said before, ISIS, when it had political territory, when it controlled land, which it does not anymore, their goal was to try to recreate the caliphate. So Islam has a huge tradition of art, architecture, and uh, intellectual pursuits. During the period of time that we refer to as the Dark Ages in Western Europe, was a period of time in which Islam was flowering. The reason why you have heard of Greek gods like Zeus and Apollo and those people, the only reason why you have ever heard of those people is because the Muslims were preserving ancient texts at the period of time when Christians were burning them. So Christians were actively trying to destroy the history and the culture that preceded Christianity while Islam was capturing it and protecting it. They weren't burning books, they were translating books. And so what you have ancient texts that are translated from ancient Greek into Arabic, and they're preserved in Arabic for hundreds of years. And then much, much, much later into the 17 and 1800s, those texts get retranslated back from Arabic into the more modern European languages like French and German and English. Islam does not allow the images of humans in art. So there are no images of the Prophet Muhammad. None. It's an offense against Islam. And so when you look at Islamic art is all about natural pattern, geometric patterns and sort of natural representations, flowers, birds, things like that. And it's also based around calligraphy. Uh, Muslims brought in ideas from all across Christendom and all across Asia and really created a vibrant culture that existed for centuries. Just one little tidbit, the numbers that you use, the actual like little images that represent the idea of two things, those are Arabic numerals. Arabs also invented the concept of zero, right? Prior to Arabs developing more complex mathematical structures like algebra, Arabs invented algebra, there was no concept of zero, right? So the ancient Greeks didn't have the concept of zero, which is a hard thing to wrap your brain around. So look a little bit at some Islamic art. Here again, as I mentioned, you have those geometric patterns, some really, really beautiful, beautiful patterns. But again, you will never see a human representation in Islamic art. So believe it or not, this is a signature. And goodness knows how long it would take to actually write your signature when it's as complex as this is. But this is sort of a combination of a signature and like a seal. The way that the United States has a seal that has like the flag and it's a circle and all that. So this was the seal of the Ottoman Empire, but it would change with every new Ottoman sultan. So this is it's called a Tura. That's how you pronounce that word. You don't really pronounce the G there. A Tura of the greatest Ottoman sultan, a man named Suleiman the Magnificent, who you will learn all about when we get to the Ottoman period. And then architecture. I showed you the outside of a mosque a few slides ago. Well, this is the inside of that same mosque. It is stunningly beautiful. I was very, very fortunate enough to actually have gone to this mosque, and the image actually can't do justice to the actual place. So, Muslims drew from architectural traditions from both India and from the Roman Empire, and here you see kind of that manifestation in all of its greatness. It's very hard to not believe in some sort of higher power when you are standing in a building as magnificent as this. And so we'll just end with a map that shows us the spread of the various world religions across the planet. And so you can see that the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, almost exclusively Christian, other than some areas where there are native peoples that still practice their ancient faiths. And then you look at Eurasia and North Africa and you see why Islam is the second largest religion on earth. It's a massive spread all across North Africa, the Sahara, all the way up into Central Asia. Whereas you see Christianity, even though the birthplace of the birthplace of Christianity is in largely Muslim territory now, and literally in the modern nation state of Israel. Then you could see the bright pink there in the Indian subcontinent. That's Hinduism. Hinduism really doesn't exist anywhere else, and yet it still is a religion practiced by over 1 billion people. And then you see those various Chinese religions in what is modern day China and the Koreas. And Japan also has a mix of Buddhism and a natural religion as well. That is it for this lecture. Thank you for listening all the way through, and be well.